Thank you so much. This is a great audience, and I'm honored to moderate the next panel of people that I really admire, and their work is incredible. My name is Rosebel Kagumire. I'm from Uganda, and I am a Pan-African feminist. I'm a writer and an activist. I'm in the struggle every day, even right here. So it'll be exciting to see other activists join us from different spaces to join me in this session, because there's been so many questions, as you already seen, about the subject on sexual and gender-based violence courts and how do we access justice. We we are going to really listen from a survivor's perspective, because we believe it's nothing for us without us, right? We need to first listen, and then we'll be able to know what are the responses that are appropriate, that are sensitive to the needs of those we're trying to address. So I'm going to be joined first by someone I call my sister. Incredible work you've done in Kenya. I've known her for some years, so I'm honored to reunite with her on the stage. Lady Wangu Kanja, Knight of the Order of the Star, Executive Director of Wangu Kanja Foundation, and the convener of the Survivors of Sexual Violence in Kenya Network. I'm so proud of you, my sister. Take the floor and tell us what we need to know. What you work with survivors on a daily basis. I would like us to really start from that survivor-informed perspective. So the floor is yours for now. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Wangu Kanja. I'm a survivor of rape, 2002, and the challenges that I went through informed the setting up of Wangu Kanja Foundation, because it is not easy having gone through rape and trying to help people understand that a crime actually happened, a violation happened. Because most of the time people say it's just sex. So why are you making it a big deal? It is a big deal, because when you go through rape, someone robs you of your dignity. It takes a lot of time for you to heal and come back to your new normal and try to integrate your new normal into your day-to-day life. And for me, 18 years later, some of the challenges that I faced 18 years ago are the same challenges survivors are facing now. And the question I beg to ask is, why are we not taking sexual violence as serious as it's supposed to be? And it pains me every other day when we are handling cases of different survivors, whether they are men, women, or children, to help them access justice. And I applaud you, Chief Justice Martha Koome. But then, that's just a drop in the ocean of what we are supposed to do for survivors of sexual violence. And I can tell you, most of the survivors of sexual violence, or a person who has gone through a traumatic experience, they have the resilience to inform interventions. Are we even engaging with survivors to know what works for them and what doesn't work for them? And then the other question that we beg to ask, where are the resources? We have the laws, they are enough. And I'll make a reference to, with this new current government, when the Inspector General came into his seat, the one thing that he ended up setting is a water unit. And for 18 years, we've been asking for a sex crimes unit that is independent to investigate, document, and also support survivors to actually understand what needs to be done when a crime happens. 18 years later, that has not happened. But then just recently, we set up a water unit. So why are we not prioritizing sexual violence? We are citizens of Kenya. And the government of the day needs to protect you and I from such heinous crimes. And for me, it's something that I struggle with every other day. Is it a language that we are lacking to help people understand the impact of sexual violence on an individual? Because if it affects me, it affects my family and also affects the community in general. And the larger picture is it affects Kenya. Because we seem not to understand that sexual violence has a very big impact on an individual. I coped using alcohol for 2.5 years. So how many other people out there are using alcohol to cope? This week, I was called by someone and they told me there's a lady who was gang raped, but she doesn't want to report. Because the stigma, the hassle, the time, the frustration, the disappointment that people lack with the system that we have in Kenya. We are talking about trust. Survivors of sexual violence don't trust the system. That's the reality. And we need to have a candid conversation about that. They don't trust the system from the onset. When I present myself, because I've gone through the violation, I will lift myself up with my injuries, with my pain. I will go to hospital. Once I get to hospital, I might get someone who is going to treat me well, with professionalism. I might not get. From the onset, how we treat survivors, it dictates whether they are going to go through the criminal justice system or the continuum of care. And that's why we see increasingly, adults especially, saying, I'd rather go to hospital, get my medication, get my counseling, and not pursue justice. And we are denying them justice. If we are charging, because some of the counties and hospitals are actually charging for even a medical report, that's a reality. Between 500 to 2,000 shillings. Police, the P3, once you get the medical report, you use it to go to the police station to report your case. They are still charging you. We can't have police stations having 100,000 Kenya shillings as budgets to run police stations. And for me, we need to get to a point where we say we are tired, because the laws provides for survivors to be offered services for free, for access to justice, for access to information, and also to be treated with dignity and respect. And for me, it's how do we ensure that Wango, with her pain and the energies that she's actually put to get to a medical facility, will get to receive the services entitled to her, the documentation that she's entitled to, so that she's able to report a case, investigations are done, and eventually she will be able to access justice. Because if you look at the number of cases that are reported at a police station or a health facility, and at the end of the day, get to actually judiciary, and I question myself, what are we doing? Why don't we have a coordination mechanism where we are bringing health, security, and justice together to have a conversation, to have a coordinated mechanism where we are not re-traumatizing survivors? We have documentations from when the person presents at the health facility, that we are collecting information in the right way, having in mind that we must help this person to access justice and in a timely manner. But then more so, Chief Justice, may I make a request? One of the things that we've been struggling with as a country is a coordination mechanism. How do we facilitate and make sure that we have a coordination mechanism that works for the survivor? And I'm happy to bring the brilliant, resilient survivors that we have under Wangu Kanja Foundation to inform the interventions, whether it's at health, security, or justice. because I'm pledging to support and to ensure survivors are able to access justice. But the most important bit is that they are treated with dignity and respect every step of the way. And the interventions are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, in the best interest of the survivor. But then the most important bit, safety and security, is at the heart of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wangu. You can stay with us. We are being joined by other panelists because, this is a topic, this is an issue not just in Kenya. We have just come out of the pandemic, and each African country has seen really the skyrocketing number of sexual and gender-based violence cases. And a lot of countries have not done anything yet. We think this is going to pass like it didn't happen, right? So it's very, very important for us to know that this is very urgent. Like seeking accountability and justice is very important now more than ever. So to join us on this panel will be Honorable Lady Justice Agnes Mugo, the President of International Association of Women Judges, Kenya. Please. Thank you. We'll be joined by Her Excellency Betty Murungi, Professor of Practice and Transitional Justice Expert. You're welcome. We'll also be joined by Florence Machio from the Office of the President's Advisor on Women's Rights. Florence, thank you. And last but not least, we'll be joined by Christine Alai, the co-founder of Utu Wetu Trust. Thank you. Good to see you all here. Thank you. We have a microphone behind. Thank you so much. We've just heard from Wangu take us through what it means for a survivor to go through a system in this country. And it's not just in this country, but in most African countries. When I listen to her, it's the reality. So we'll just like to go to Florence from the Office of the President, Advisor of Women's Rights. Having listened to the prevailing situation, the condition on sexual and gender-based violence and access to justice, what are the efforts being done from that level, from your office, really to respond to these kind of questions that remain for survivors to feel seen and justice served?
Thank you, Rosabel. When I saw Rosabel, I almost hugged her because we worked together at some time in Uganda and in East Africa. Thank you, Wanja, Wangu, for sharing, because one of the most important things is to hear from survivors and to have solutions that speak from a survivor's perspective. Wangu and I have worked together when I was outside government. Now that I'm in government, I am looking through and seeing what is my reason for being in the Office of the President, Women's Rights Advisor, and how do I pick the lessons we've learned outside and bring them here and in this office. And also when Washuka was speaking earlier, I was resonating with everything she's saying, that it's not about the pay anymore, but it's about what we need to do to make things happen for survivors. So I'm very proud being in that office. I'm happy that our CJ is a woman that I know, and she fulfilled her promise, which was to get us SGBV courts running. And so I'm very excited, Madam CJ, for what you've done, and really appreciate what you've done. So because then it makes our work almost halfway done, because the rest of the work is outside now of the judiciary. How do we ensure that the health system works? How do we ensure that the police works? How do we ensure that the investigations that are collected are preserved well enough for a judge to be able to make the decision that they need to make? And so when I was at the launch on Monday, when the SGBV courts were launched, when the registry was launched, when I went back to the office, the conversation we had, and we will soon be coming to see you, Honorable CJ, to discuss how best to fill in the gaps. The beauty of the question you asked was around coordination. And what we see ourselves at the Office of the Women's Rights Advisor is to now bring in the coordinations, see the gaps within the different agencies, call them to action. Also, although sometimes we are being called like we are telling them out to the president, because when we see the police is slugging, we are cracking the whip from that level. So we've done several advisories on the gaps. We've questioned the issue of, if we have anti-stock theft unit, why don't we have a sex crimes unit? So one of the things we are pushing, Madam CJ, is to ensure that the rest of the gaps, based on the different agencies, speak to the response of survivor and survivor-centered, but number two, how then do we prevent all this from happening in the first place? So we'll soon roll out a campaign on protection, which the president will pronounce himself. It is not happening now, but very soon. And to just collaborate with what is going to be happening at the judiciary. Because like Madam CJ said, she doesn't investigate. But how do we ensure that we reduce the cases that actually end up there by making sure that the community is involved, but also structures are in place for safety. This country has a lot, if we look at statistics around teenage pregnancy, and how I look at them is these are defilements are quite high. So what are we going to do with the communities to ensure that we prevent defilement of children before they get to, the justice system? So that is all in the pipeline. You know that this office is fairly new. We are hardly a year old, but we are putting systems in place, and soon the women and girls of Kenya will start seeing the reason why that office is in place in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence. I will come back to you later. But now I would like to go to Honorable Lady Justice Murgo. You have vast experience on this issue of accountability. And where is the progress, not just in Kenya, but as a continent? And where do these courts fit in? Like Florence had said, the courts are just one, but a specialized intervention. Where have we seen progress? What are the challenges that remain?
Thank you so much for that question. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. SGBV. I think it's about time we have our countries declare it to be a pandemic. Just how we dealt with COVID, just how we've dealt with many other pandemics, it needs to be declared a pandemic so that we can all take dealing with it very, very seriously. For us here in Kenya, since we enacted, this has been going on for many years, but since we enacted the Sexual Offences Act, we have continued to see the number of cases rise. And COVID didn't help the situation. It just exacerbated it, and we had all these cases coming into our courts. And what we then realized as women judges and magistrates is that with so many cases coming to court, why can't we just focus on dealing with the cases, simply because they were not getting through the court process fast enough? We were having cases that would be sitting around the courts. The survivors would be coming to court, their cases are mentioned. They would get fed up and they would go away. One just talked about the kind of trauma that survivors go through. So we've been agitating for quite a while to get these SGBV courts set up, simply because the cases would be in our courts, the victims are being traumatized, they're being traumatized in the communities, they're being told to settle these cases, we'll give you a cow so that we can settle the case and we don't have to go back to court again. And we found that such a large number of these cases were either being dismissed or withdrawn. Now just imagine that. You have a survivor. They've taken the trouble, the pain, to finally get their case into court. And then it's going around the court system, and then what happens? It's finally withdrawn because the perpetrators escaped, or there are no witnesses, or the complainant just gave up. It was traumatic for us as judges and magistrates, and We then were able to, by the grace of God, get a woman Chief Justice, Martha Kome. And through her, we were able to launch the first SGBV courts. But the truth of the matter is we can only deal with the cases that come to court. And as women judges, what we then decided to do is to work with the CUCs. You heard our Chief Justice mentioning the CUCs. We have court user committees that are attached to each and every court. And within those CUCs, we have a representation of members of the police, the prosecution, the prisons. We have the defenders, we have survivors, we have a fantastic network there that courts then use to be able to push these cases through to their logical conclusion. So the problem that we see is, as you ask, it's accountability. It's accountability from the moment a case is reported up until the moment a judgment is rendered, or up until even after that. What happens through that whole process? And we find more and more that the cases being reported are so many, but by the time they get to court, they're a drop in the bucket. And then you ask us as judges and magistrates, how many of those cases finally get to the point where a judgment is rendered? So across the whole process, we all have to be accountable. And that's why I say, we need to declare this a pandemic so that the police, the moment it is reported, the cases the number of cases are accounted for at the police point. And then when it gets to prosecution, why didn't the 100 cases get to prosecution? Maybe only 50 got to prosecution. What happened to the other 50? We need to be accountable for even those 50 cases that didn't get to the prosecution. And likewise to court. And we should all along the chain be held accountable. So for as long as we're not taking this seriously, we're not going to get the accountabilities at the levels that we need. But at least we know for ourselves as a court that we will be accountable for the ones that come to court. And likewise, because of the way in which we're handling the cases these days, we're saying that we should be able to see each case through to its logical conclusion. Let me stop there. I could go on forever.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, you've touched so many parts of this in terms of access to justice. So I'll go to you, Her Excellency Murungi. You have expertise in transitional justice in this country and the continent. Would like to hear your thoughts on the role of specialized courts like this on gender-based violence, for the fight of gender-based violence in this country and the continent. And are there other forms of justice as we push for criminalization that we could also be aware of? Thank you.
Thank you, Rosebell, and good morning, everyone. You've asked like 5 questions in one question. So the role of these specialized courts, I mean, just speaking about the experience of South Africa, the United Kingdom has also had specialized courts. Rwanda has had specialized courts. Has been really to increase effectiveness, to increase efficiency, to enable expertise, because as these courts are established, the judiciary, and I'm sure our CJ knows this very well and has made sure that it will happen within the strategy, is to ensure that the people who are working in these courts have the necessary training, have the necessary knowledge in terms of just dealing with the children and the women and girls who come, and boys who come through these courts. But also the coordination. Wangu was talking about coordination, but there's also importance of coordinating all the agencies that are taking, that are going to be using these specialized courts. So no point having judicial officers being very well trained and being very well able to deal with SGBV cases if the investigators and prosecutors are not trained similarly. If there is no medical, sort of intervention, and by medical intervention, speak about the experiences of the international courts. And the experiences of the international court here, I'm talking about the ICTR, which is the court that was put in place by the United Nations. It was an ad hoc court to deal with the crimes that were committed in Rwanda in 1994 for a specific period during the genocide against the Tutsis. And what this court did was obviously to ensure that in terms of dealing with sexual violence, that there was assistance for victims. And the assistance for victims was actually challenged by the legal office at the United Nations at the time because it was not considered a judicial function. And so therefore, the idea was that the court had no business providing this assistance. And what was the assistance? We know that during the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis, the numbers that were being bandied about was between 250,000 and 500,000 women had been raped or had suffered sexual violence of some sort. The fact that even people talk about these numbers as if there's no difference between 250,000 and 500,000 is upsetting enough and goes to what we were talking about earlier about access to justice and so on. So the assistance then would have been medical intervention because a lot of the women also had ended up getting HIV, so they needed the medication. And then it transpired that there was no point of medication in that time if there was no food because you needed to have proper nutrition to have the medication. So coming back to a situation closer to home and where there is an SGBV court would be South Sudan, and I'm glad to see Christine here, because South Sudan has also been in crisis for quite a long time, and Christine and I worked there quite closely together, and they've set up an SGBV court which has actually helped to expedite cases of conflict-related or atrocity-related sexual violence, which is a little, which is described as conflict-related sexual violence because it happened within the context of a conflict. And the result has been, it is one court, they can see the difference in terms of expedited cases, in terms of investigations and referrals, because the victims that come through this court are also then referred to the hospitals. But the court in that kind of context then exists really because donors and agencies like UN Women, UNFPA and others are supporting, another foreign governments are supporting the court. So that's within the context of conflict. Now, speaking, and here I want to turn to Wango because I think she made a very important point, and that point was about being consulted about any intervention. Now, in 2007, right here in Nairobi, we convened, we being Urgent Action Fund Africa, of which I was then director and founder, convened survivors of sexual violence from 12 countries that had gone through conflict, right from Sri Lanka to Rwanda to DRC, all over South Africa even, and then of course we ourselves here, and many of the countries in the Great Lakes region. Of the 12 countries in the Great Lakes region, only Zambia and Tanzania have not gone through conflict-related sexual violence. And we learned something from these survivors and the victims, that the one thing they prioritize, first of all, they said, you do not tell us what justice looks like to us. What does justice look like to a survivor of sexual violence? And many of them actually said it was not being in the court. Many of them actually said that justice to them was ensuring that the conditions that existed that permitted the sexual violence to take place should be dealt with. And I think this is one contribution that these SGBV courts can make in Kenya and anywhere else, is in helping us establish what are those structural causes that permit this high levels of SGBV that Justice Mugo has talked about, which are only rising. What are those conditions? What are those structural causes that we need to deal with? Because it's great having the courts, but that doesn't deal with the problem of prevention. Mm-hmm. We want to prevent it. We have all of these exciting documents and action plans to implement UN Resolution 1325. We have the 11, I think, resolutions. I think 4 of them are dealing specifically on sexual violence in conflict, in times of peace, and so on. But what we know and what Kenya proved to us is that actually the conditions that permitted, and I know Christine is going to talk about this, for sexual violence to be exacerbated during the conflict that we had here around post-election violence, those are the issues that we need to deal with if we are going to address the question of justice more broadly and not just deal with the symptom or try to answer just a very narrow part of dealing with the perpetrator of the 10% or the 5% of cases that actually come to court. And then, of course, there are the issues about the justice gap, which we haven't even gotten into, because the other systems of justice that you're asking about, there's this whole notion about the African Transitional Justice Policy Framework, which is being implemented across many African countries. It could be problematic in terms of dealing with sexual violence, and that's another whole conversation that I think needs to be had.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think that gives us like a transition to Christine's intervention in terms of the fact that the specialized court in Kenya is happening outside the conflict. Oftentimes when we are looking at sexual violence in conflict, people are paying attention because it's a conflict, but we forget that actually this is an exacerbation of the realities that exist before the conflict. It just doesn't wake up and there's sexual violence. It's already here. It's in our private spaces, in our families, in our interpersonal spaces, but also in public spaces. Coming from Uganda, working with women politicians, amount of sexual violence that's happening in political spaces is enormous. And these are the women, we expect them to come and also defend us, right? So we have to recognize that sexual violence exists at all levels of our society, even in offices, even, informal sector. It's a prevalent situation. So Tina, I wanted us to go through what are these gaps that we see existing how are the courts going to address that? But outside the courts, how can the courts be a game changer as we know that the roots are also like an equal gendered power and a patriarchal society? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Good morning. A big shout out to Nalafem. When you asked us to wear pink and yellow, what I could think about was disruption. Yeah. And I feel it in the room. I feel it with the conversations we've been having and with the tough questions we're asking ourselves. It calls on us to disrupt, do things differently, think about things differently, because we're fighting a huge challenge that's been so entrenched in every space of our lives. And so I want to congratulate you, Nalafem, for the 2nd year, and you continue to do great work. Thank you to the Chief Justice and the judiciary for setting the pace of what disruption could potentially look like. There's a lot to say, and a lot has been said as well. I just want to touch on a few things or proposals that we can think about. I think about these SGBV courts as being a potential, a gateway for transformative justice, because it's dealing with such a critical theme We're looking at gender-based discrimination that then results in violations that end up coming to a courtroom. So there's a really long journey before we get to that courtroom. But how do we use the courtroom process to shift mindsets, to shift attitudes, to tackle and confront these norms that have caused the victim to be before us? So when we think about accessibility, we know all the challenges with resources, investments, and budgets and funding. One experience we've seen across the region is particularly in the African region. It's a lesson that we're seeing mostly in post-conflict countries, but we can bring it home. Have we thought about mobile courts? So that we're not, it's great we now have the 11 specialized courts, but when we look at countries such as Sierra Leone, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, as Betty just mentioned, Somalia, Central African Republic, the way in which they are moving closer to affected communities is in fact using the judiciary, law enforcement, health facilities, integrated services in very close collaboration with communities to identify cases and make sure that they don't have to wait to travel from Kilifi to Shanzu, and that in fact we can take the justice to the victims in an organized way that does not disrupt due process and so on. So physical accessibility also means going closer to the communities that are affected. But the other lesson we're learning, and this came from COVID, I was sitting back and asking myself, why can't we have virtual courtrooms? Disruption. We had, I know the judges and magistrates have had a difficult time with my colleagues. Some of us come into courtrooms in our vehicles, very interesting scenes with virtual courtrooms. But nonetheless, I think it's to ask ourselves the question, if we really are to deal with the numbers, with affordability, with accessibility, is there room for digital access to justice? And what can that look like in our various fora? The second thing, we've talked about competencies. And across the board, I really like the point that Betty raised about cross-sectoral, multi-sectoral competencies. When I worked with Physicians for Human Rights, we did trainings that involved right from the chief to the social worker, to the medics, to the police officers, and judges and magistrates all sitting together in the same courtroom. The learning was eye-opening. When you'd hear a magistrate or judge saying, I've been meaning to ask, but I cannot ask it in the courtroom. When a clinician says there was an injury at 12 o'clock on the vagina, some magistrates have never had the opportunity to learn what that means. Or what weight do you give to medical forensic evidence vis-a-vis witnesses' testimony? How do you ensure corroboration of evidence even when a survivor does not have a post-rape care form? How do you corroborate the story? Now, that appreciation of the technicalities across sectors is extremely critical. But having said that, the question then to pose for Kenya as we set up these SGBV courts, we've known that across the board, cases will come to any judge or magistrate. Are we going to have specialized judges and magistrates manning the SGBV courts? Will we have a category similar to what we have with land courts, commercial courts, such that if I were to apply to the judiciary as an SGBV court magistrate or judge, my specialized training will ensure that my next transfer is to another SGBV court, so that we consolidate and build the competencies within the judiciary. And I want to end just with a proposal, asking the question, who is likely to be left out? This question of intersectionality, where are the male survivors? What mechanisms and measures are we putting in place so that we have a 360-degree collaboration from survivors, but also men, children, sexual minorities? as we're transforming, let's ensure that we're leaving nobody behind insofar as gender-based violence is concerned. I'll stop there for now.
Absolutely brilliant, Tina. It's very, very important not to remind us that we're not homogeneous. Women are not homogeneous. As citizens, we are not homogeneous. Some people are more disadvantaged than others. Even when we introduce new initiatives, there's always somebody else on the side. So our job is to constantly look on the margins and bring those people to the table, to the initiative that is being launched. Thank you so much. I will give now an opportunity for 3 questions because we are battling time actually. 3 questions. Audience. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zaina Kombo. I work at Amnesty International Kenya as a campaign manager against inequalities and discrimination. But today I want to speak as a woman human rights defender and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya who supports survivors, stroke victims, whichever applies. I have a question, and this is to Justice Mugo. Assuming everything goes well, in the hospital you get the service, at the police station you get all the services. But then you bring the case to court, and there's this group that frustrates the process, and I don't know what to do with them, or we don't know what to do with them, because I know we are a couple of us who support survivors. Those who offer the cows or accept the cows, seems like there's a loophole in the law that prevents, because even if you say the court declines the application to withdraw the matter, the witnesses just won't come. And the case will keep on being mentioned and mentioned and adjourned until nothing is done. We still have the survivor, we still have the prosecution who is willing to prosecute, but the family members, the parents, the cousins, the uncles, and I'm talking about mostly defilement and sodomy, children who cannot sometimes speak for themselves. We've heard of 3-year-old cases. In that instance, what can we do? I have grappled with that question, and I thank God that I'm here today to ask this question and seek counsel from my seniors so that we see what we can do. Because even if we have the specialized courts, but the mother of this child decides she will not testify because the perpetrator is the father, who is also the provider. So what do we do with this group of people? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there was behind. Yes.
So my name is Doreen Mora from the One Campaign. One is a global movement campaigning against extreme poverty and infectious diseases. So I also happen to work in the HIV/SRH space. And the National Syndemic Disease Control Council is running a campaign called End Triple Threat. Triple threat in terms of HIV, teen pregnancies, and SGBV. So one time we happened to be at the coastal region. There is a whole problem in that region in terms of sodomy, incest, rape, and no justice is being sought. The chiefs are paid 1,500, and then the cases are just swept under the rug. So as you're coming up with this quote, how are we reaching these children? Because we found a 14-year-old boy who was being sodomized by his father, and he could not go anywhere. Like, there was no way of helping him because the father is the primary caregiver and you can't detach both of them. So how do you go about this as we are coming up with this particular special code? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Imelda Miere. I work for an organization called Ushindi Empowerment. Ushindi Empowerment is part of the global network for women's shelter. My question basically goes to Florence Machio. Apparently, Before she joined the government, she was actually training us in Kisumu on issues of the East African sexual bill. My question is, we've all had Wanji's story, and my own understanding is a lot of things do not happen because we do not have safe houses in Kenya. Most safe houses in Kenya are organizational based, meaning if the funding ends, most safe houses close up. So I am tending to think, like Wanja said, most people would rather go to the hospital and get the service, that is the medical service, and avoid the justice part, the judicial part, simply because we do not have safe houses. The first thing we need to understand is, as a survivor or either a victim of SGBV, one needs to be removed from that space and just taken into a safe space. So how do we again make these women or children comfortable enough to say out their stories, to report, if we expect them to just have the conversation in the same community, in the same space that this violation happened? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question behind. Then
thank you very much. My name is Mami Masimane from Refugee Women Care. I'm from DRC Congo. I'm represent the refugee women in Nairobi. Allow me to speak in Swahili, please. Nawashukuru sana dada zangu kwa kutupea nafasi pia na kwa kutukaribisha Kenya, sababu tumekuwa pia wa Kenya kama nyinyi, na mimi kwangu ni furaha leo kuona na sisi pia tumepata nafasi ili tuongee, kwa sababu kuna gender based violence sana kwa refugees, kwa camp ama kwa community. Na kwa sababu mimi nilifanya kama mwakilishi wa gender, familia na mtoto kwa nchi yangu, province ya South Kivu, na ndio sasa wakati nimepatana na Femnet na Women Rep, nimeona kama nisimame nitembee na wamama. Na kweli nashukuru Nalafem kwa kutupea nafasi. Asante sana. Na Kenya pia kwa kutukaribisha refugees wote from different country here in Kenya, because your hospitality is too much for refugees here. But the problem you are facing is the same problem refugees are facing. Na tunaomba pia justice to allow, to give a way for refugees to access also justice. Please give us the place to speak to you, to understand us, and to follow our cases in justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm taking the last question here.
Okay, I'm Teresa Monchari from Africa Youth Trust. We have a project, Access to Justice and Security, which is sponsored by ActionAid Kenya. And I have a question. As much as we fighting for justice for the survivors, we find that from the basis for the first interaction of a survivor, we find is that the police who go out to do the investigations, to make the arrest and all that. Then we find that they might not, or they don't have the capacity to handle the survivors and their issues. So I was thinking, like, is there a mechanism that we can capacity build, or we can sensitize the police on the best way to handle the survivors, taking keen interest on the best interest of the survivors until they get the confidence. Of course, the first interaction will put the basis on how the survivor is going to pursue justice to the end. So I think we need to find a way on how we can educate or give these police the capacity on handling SGBV service survivors. Another thing is after attaining the justice, we find that most of the survivors undergo the SGBV from maybe their partners or because of their economic status. So they might go through the justice system, they get justice. What is the exit system? Or how can we empower these survivors so that they cannot be dependent on the perpetrators? Because we find like the defilement, the domestic violence, they're perpetrated by by their spouses.
So to give them security, we need to find a way to empower them economically so that they can be stable, they can be able to make their own decisions away from the perpetrator.
Thank you. Thank you so much. These are brilliant questions. I think we'll go straight to Justice Mugo. This was very specific on the court process. If you could respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosebell. The issue of the SGBV courts, really, for us, what we are envisaging, and you know, this is something we're aspiring to, is to ensure that at the end of the day, we are able to address, or this center of a court would be able to address all the different issues that come out. So like, for example, was it Teresa or Imelda, you mentioned about the shelters. As women judges, we've been trying to advocate for each county to have a shelter. There is nothing more trying for a magistrate who is hearing these cases to have a survivor in front of her in court or him and not know where to send the survivor, because sending them back home is just going to be a repeat of the same problem. So we've been encouraging all counties, and this is something we've been advocating for, that each county at least set up a shelter, at least as a first port of call for, you know, survivors of SGBV. And Nairobi County did pick up the call, the heed for the call, and they've been setting up, you know, shelters. Unfortunately, it's taken a long time. They're still in the process of trying to complete the shelters. So this is something that we're hoping will come to fruition, and we'll continue to press government and press the governors to at least think about these courts. For Zaina's case, where we're talking about what happens to the victims in the communities, this for us is a really huge problem, because you find that that it is the community that actually pressurizes the victims and the witnesses not to come to court. So there we are, and like you rightly say, the cases are mentioned, but nobody is coming to court. We had a very innovative magistrate somewhere up in the Turkana area, and I'll just give this as an example. She had all these cases being mentioned, no witnesses coming to court because they were settling their cases out there in the community. And she said, I'm taking my CUC, my court user committee. We are going to go out into the committee, into the community, and we're going to create awareness. We're going to sensitize the community that what they're doing is actually illegal. And you heard the Chief Justice say today, you cannot settle crimes under SGBV or under the Sexual Offences Act. It is illegal, and the communities need to know this. It's like FGM. It is illegal. So if you get involved in trying to settle these cases, you're obstructing the the cause of justice. We should actually be charging those families that are doing this within the community. And at the end of the day, it's really what we should be doing. We also have in our laws the witness protection program, where you're interfering with witnesses. You can go back to court, and the court can make orders for you to be restrained from going anywhere near the witness and putting that witness into a protection program. So there's ways and means of dealing with these issues. I can see Rosebell's trying to stop me. I could go on.
Yes, we are running out of time, so we'll take 2 minutes each to kind of speak the different issues. Wango, there was a note. Sure. Oh, sure.
The question on safe houses, which the Honorable Justice has mentioned. So Kenya committed itself under the Generation Equality Forum to have 47 safe houses. That means one in each county. It is on our desk. It's going to happen. That's a promise. It's going to happen. That we're going to have safe houses, starting with where the statistics are, the hotspots, and then ensuring that we liaise with the CJ's office to ensure then how do we make them one-stop centers and have some of those courts within those safe houses. We already have land given by different county governments, and so we want a state-run safe house, because what that means is that then budgets are put in place, human resources put in place, and therefore when a partner comes to support, you're supporting an existing structure, and then it outlives all of us, and we reduce, the challenges that the judges have, the challenges that the police have. You do understand when you show up at the police station and you're violated, and you've done all, you've gone to the hospital, you've gone to the police, and you don't want to go back home. Where do you go? And so because of that commitment that government put in place around the Generational Equality Forum, it's going to happen.
Thank you so much for that firm, promise that we are on track on that issue. Wangu, I wanted to bring you in. There was a kind of comment on regional, of course, there are regional issues in terms of where some majority of the cases are, and building from Tina's point, the fact that we have to think of intersectionality, and we see a lot of boys and men sometimes unable to come and you lead the network. So I wanted you to have a say on that, on those observations, and how we can really change that.
Thank you. So under the Survivors of Sexual Violence in Kenya network, we have men and women. We have children, but we don't engage with children because of child protection issues. And increasingly, what we are doing is mentoring survivors who are both men and women, and also nurturing their different passions that they have, to make sure that at the end of the day, if we were to go into a meeting and inform either developing of interventions or budgeting or helping people to understand the dynamics that come with sexual violence, we have survivors speaking. Because one of the things that we've realized is civil society organizations, majority of them, are speaking on behalf of survivors. They are not creating a platform for survivors to speak, to express themselves, to bring their concerns, because with their concerns, then the right interventions are actually going to be put in place. And I just want to mention one thing in regards to safe houses. Survivors are not homogeneous. One shelter per county cannot work, because you will have survivors who have gone through sexual violence because of trafficking, survivors of sexual violence in conflicts, survivors of sexual violence in peacetime, and survivors of sexual violence during childhood, and then also vulnerable groups, sex workers and LGBTQ. You can't lump them up in one shelter. For me, the conversation would actually be, even as we are setting the county safe houses, how do you leverage on existing safe houses that have been set up by private institutions or individuals to cater for the different groups of survivors that we have, so that we just don't say all survivors go into that shelter and you will get the interventions that you need, because their requirements are different.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wango. We're chasing time, and I'll come to Her Excellency Murungi. If you could speak about, someone raised an issue on economic autonomy. It's a very big issue in terms of survivors navigating out of the violence that is recurrent. Often it's always recurrent.
Thank you. I think it goes to the question of the question I had raised earlier, which is understanding the structural drivers of sexual violence in communities. When the Chief Justice came to dedicate the court, the SGBV court in Sierra, we had a conversation around this question, and the question was, yes, we've established the courts, but we know the reason why we have so many cases of sexual violence in this county. And part of that reason has been reported even in our KNDS reports of this year. There's a lot of incest in some counties, and I think one of the interlocutors did speak about the coast. Parts of Nyanza also, it's very, very high. And that response is not going to be by the judiciary. It's going to be by the community working together to, first of all, establish and acknowledge those structural drivers. What the court will do is also help us identify the patterns of sexual violence and gender-based violence. We also know from our own KNDS report that violence against boys and men is also very, very high. So these courts are not being established just to look at cases against, committed against young women and girls. Finally, let me just speak to the other question you'd asked, which I didn't answer, and I'll do it in half a minute, which is about alternative justice, access to justice in communities, given that formal courts, you only have 10% or even less accessing our formal justice systems. So one great example is the example from Rwanda, where they had their own traditional courts, which they called gacaca, which had taken sexual violence out of the ambit of crimes to be amnestied, and in fact it was considered a category 1 crime. And then the national justice system went ahead to establish specialized courts, but also specialized prosecuting authorities, so that the prosecuting authorities were just specially trained on sexual violence. And then they established centers, which they called Isange centers, one-stop centers. Madam Pumzile would know about this because UN Women supported the establishment of all those one-stop centers, which were established in the hospitals. In Kenya, we had centers known as GVRCs. I don't know whether they still exist, but those were really sort of powerful. But in Rwanda, they were connected. There was an interagency cooperation, so that you went to the hospital, the investigator you met there, the police you met there, the psychosocial support you got there, the medication and treatment you got there. And so it was one center, so you didn't have to go through this re-traumatization, going to different police stations and so on, and filing your case. So I'll just sort of end on that note and say that it will be important for us to establish the drivers, but also the patterns, so that we can effectively respond by doing prevention work, not just accepting that now Kenya is a transit center for trafficking of girls and women, and yet, so what are we doing about it? We are taking them to court. Why is that so? Why is that the case? There's something about our society that is permitting these types of crimes to take place.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Tina, I wanted to bring the questions of refugees and the status of refugees, and the fact that mechanisms sometimes forget that we are hosting this region, one of the highest hosts of refugees in the whole world, actually, Uganda, Kenya, and other countries in the region. So it's very important that any intervention takes note that we are actually not leaving anybody behind, like you said. So how do we actually ensure that refugees in this country are not left behind?
Thank you so much, Rosebell. I'd like to build on the comments made by the rest of the panelists, and really the emphasis on prevention work. I think that's a really critical thing for us to think about. Programming around prevention is critical. On refugees, I'll tie it to what we have been discussing in terms of response to SGBV along the full continuum, in all the spaces where it's occurring, in all the communities that are affected, so that we take time to strategically think about who we are hosting, what avenues. When we collect the information from refugees who may have been violated in the Democratic Republic of Congo, do we only offer them rehabilitation services, or do we channel that information to spaces where they can actually access justice through their various mechanisms? I just want to end on the point about protection. We've seen in various specialized courts across the region, tied to what Honorable Murgo was saying earlier, they set up specialized units that are attached to the court and do what we'd call extrajudicial work, right? So they call them victims protection units, victims and witnesses protection units that can then interact closely with communities to do the work that we were speaking about earlier. Final point, the continuum of justice. A question to our judiciary. Are we thinking about the International Crimes Act in equipping the SGBV court? Speaking about our experience with victims of the post-election violence, if I were to put out the statistic now, there were more than 900 cases. Ourselves, Physicians for Human Rights, Independent Medical Legal Unit, and now Utuwetu Supporting, have been in court in a constitutional petition since 2013. 10 years today. So the bigger question from where we began, how do we disrupt? How do we use the court process to speak to the patriarchy, to confront and counter the beliefs about SGBV? Many other big cases have been brought to the judiciary and finished within months. And we can begin to speak against SGBV, including how we put in place protection mechanisms, how much time it takes to conclude those cases, and the types of remedies that must not stop at putting the perpetrator behind bars, but ensuring that we're looking at the holistic view of rehabilitating the survivor. And that's possible through our courtrooms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for ending us on that note. Powerful. Thank you. Thank you, my panelists. You've been great in touching all the issues we expected to bring forward. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Florence. Thank you, Honorable Justice. Thank you, Wangu. Thank you, Honorable Her Excellency Murungi. I'm so grateful that we have been able to have this conversation, and I hope that we actually gave you the kind of answers that had been missing from the opening session, and that we'll build on to that in our next panels. Thank you to the awesome audience with the questions you brought forward and challenging us to think. Thank you so much. Our panel is closing. We'll continue the conversation in the corridors, lunchtime. Our speakers are still available. We went a little bit over time, accountability. We're sorry for that. And I hand over to our great MC. Thank you.